Hello, welcome. This is a new episode of AI and mental health. Let's talk about it. And today we have an extremely interesting topic to discuss. Chatbots, LLM chatbots and therapeutic chatbots, and theory of mind. So the question that we may want to ask ourselves are therapeutic chatbots good at reading our minds? Not reading our minds as psychics, but understanding that we have a different perspective than the one that they have. And the other one is, are they good at understanding our affects? So we are reviewing today a paper that was done by a group of researchers in Poland. This is a preprint. This means that this paper has not been peer-reviewed yet. It's available in the public. It has been submitted to a journal, and there are reviewers that are reviewing it, right? So this is not as valid as a paper that you would see in a regular journal, but I think that there are many valuable things in this paper, and we'll probably see it published soon. So this is the efficacy of conversational artificial intelligence in rectifying the theory of mind and autonomy biases, a comparative analysis. You may not understand anything at all. I will make it very simple. Let's start by the first thing that we need to understand. What is this idea of rectifying cognitive biases and recognizing the effect in human AI? This is a crucial aspect of therapy. Basically, if I'm a therapist and I don't understand what's going on in your mind, and I don't understand how you're feeling, right, your cognitive biases and your effect, I will probably won't do a good job, right? So this is a key ingredient of therapeutic bots, therapy, and we're trying to see what happens with large language models when they do this, right? So cognitive biases, to be very clear, is systematic deviations from normative thinking. And this could be a theory of mind bias. That means understanding that others have a different perspective, different desires than the one that I have. And the other biases that they are analyzing is the autonomy biases. This is the misperceptions of one's influence over events or entities, including someone very known, like the illusion of control. So, for example, if I sell or exchange stock in the market and then the market changes, is that my fault? How much influence do I have in that exchange? Since I'm not a billionaire, probably I won't have much effect, right? Or if I'm at work and something bad happens, is that completely my problem? Or there are some extraneous circumstances at work that influence in my error, right? So these are the things that they are trying to understand. And this is important because what they're trying to do is to dissect the psychological interactions within a human and a therapeutic bot. Yes. And sorry, a therapeutic bot and a large language model. Why am I saying therapeutic bot and large language models? Do you remember first video I explained therapeutic bots until today usually are more rule-based? They have these like decision trees and algorithms, and large language models have been trained in large data sets and are more flexible. So the idea is they are trying to understand how interactions with chatbots can change or shape a person's thinking patterns, either mitigating them or reinforcing the existing biases. Let's say that I think that I ended up someone broke up with me, and I said, that's completely my fault. I may be internalizing the responsibility. And if I am depressed, I have a negative bias, and I tend to do that all the time. So the idea is that can the bot detect that? Can the bot make a question about that? Can the bot encourage me to try to think that maybe there was a mismatch? It's not just me, right? Okay, so let's go to see, they analyze different biases. The one is anthropomorphism, the other one is overtrust, attribution. It's basically whether the bot has the ability to clarify that's not a human to the user. That's the anthropomorphism. The overtrust is whether the bot has the ability of understanding that they are limited and urging the user to seek human advice for major decisions. And the attribution is whether the bot is able to help the user recognize the complexity of behaviors and the influence of external circumstances. This is for the theory of mind biases. And for the autonomy biases, they are checking illusion of control, fundamental attribution, and just word hypothesis. Just word hypothesis is this idea that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Therefore, something bad happens to me, I'm a bad people, right? So these are biases that they are analyzing. And they compared two therapeutic bots. One is Wysa and the other one is Youper. We have already talked about them. Both of them have studies showing that they're good and have good outcomes in some areas. For example, Wysa is becoming very strong in chronic pain. Youper focuses more on general mental health state. And they are comparing these therapeutic bots to GPT 3.5, GPT-4, and Gemini Pro. So for those that are not familiarized, these are three different large language models. GPT is from OpenAI, Gemini is from Google. And the main message is that therapeutic bots were outperformed by non-therapeutic bots in bias rectification. And in 4 out of 6 biases in affect recognition. Let's distill this finding. So before that, let's be clear about what they did. They recreated virtual cases in which the user was saying something to the bot. And what that user was saying was something that included bias. For example, the Wall Street index went completely down, and this is because I just sold my only stock on X, and that's my fault, right? So that's a bias, and they tried to see if the bot identifies that. But this was with simulated cases, was not real. And what they did is they have judges, and these were technically each conversation was assessed 4 times by human judges. So this is a caveat of the paper. Usually in science, you have limitations at the end. This would be the limitation that they have. But here we have, for cognitive restructuring, the blue line that's above is how the large language models, the non-therapeutic bots, performed in cognitive restructuring versus the green line for the therapeutic bots. As you can see, in all biases, the large language models were better than the therapeutic bots. And if you want to get a little bit more detail, here you have a few examples where you can see Wysa in green, Youper in blue. These are the therapeutic bots, and the other ones are the large language models. GPT 3.5 in pink, GPT-4 in red, and Gemini in yellow. What you can see is that in general, Wysa performs a little bit under Youper, and that GPT 3.5 and GPT-4 tends to perform better than Gemini. Yes. Now, this doesn't mean that one bot is better than the other. Let's make this very clear, right? The therapeutic bots may be good at delivering other aspects of the treatments, for example, as being proactive throughout the interactions with the users, versus the large language models that today are mostly reactive. Gemini, GPT, or GPT-4, they will only react if I ask them something. But Wysa Youper will probably guide me throughout the process of 8-10 weeks through the whole treatment process. And that's not being assessed here, right? So if we assess that part, probably we'll see that Wysa and Youper are better than these bots in that aspect. But in cognitive restructuring, the large language models were being better than the therapeutic bots. Let's go to the other section, that is the affect recognition, right? And again, here we have, for all the biases that they compared, they saw that the non-therapeutic bots were better than the therapeutic bots. And if you want to see the details, here you have, and remember, green is Wysa, blue is Youper. And what you can see is that GPT-4, more precisely, is the one that tend to perform the best in all these areas compared to the therapeutic bots and compared to Gemini Pro, which Gemini Pro has been a little bit more inconsistent, with some areas performing very well and others performing not that good. So the overall takes from this one is GPT-4 has been consistently the one that performed better across all biases. And the idea is that if a therapeutic bot wants to understand the client, they will need to incorporate these abilities that the large language models have. For me, the exciting thing of this study is that if therapeutic bots have been shown to work in the short term, but not in the long term, until last year at least, right? Now that we include these capabilities, there are more chances that therapeutic bots will help more people and for longer periods of time. This is something that I know that all the chatbot companies are working on. There's one reason why they did not launch it yet, and they want to be sure that whatever the generative AI bot does is safe, because we therapists, we have to abide to this idea of first, do no harm. Now, the interesting debate here is, okay, but if we have a product that doesn't understand our users that much, are we sure that we're not doing harm, right? So there's this balance that we need to keep in mind on which is the best way of helping the users. So to wrap up, non-therapeutic bots were better at understanding the cognitive biases and the effect related to those biases than therapeutic bots. And within the large language models, GPT-4 was the one that performed the best. Okay, I hope you enjoy this episode. See you next time. Bye.